how much power exactly does one? I can't say little. It's a continent of itself. Power does one island have, especially against a superpower? Well, we're about to take a look with how Australia is crashing the world economy and taking down China. Let's get into it.
This is the Australian ship called the Topaz. In June of 2020, this ship left the port of Queensland in Australia with 90,000 tons of coal as its cargo. And its
Jesus, that's a lot of coal.
destination was the port of Jingtang, where it was set to unload its coal and then travel back to Australia over the course of several days. But that's not what happened, because once the Topaz reached the port of Jingtang, it was not allowed into the Chinese port. So the ship waited. 1 month passed, 2 months.
You got to wonder exactly how much money it cost a company for these ships to sit in a harbor because they're not allowed entry or because there's a backlog, which happened here during and after COVID. It makes you wonder exactly how much money, because not only are you dealing with the fuel that it's still going to need just even sitting there, unless the crew can, which I'd say even anchoring, you're still gonna, I don't know, generators still take fuel. So fuel cost, and then you've also got wages and stuff like that of the workers on the ship itself. It's already talking about a month, and these ships normally, a day or two, 3 times, turnaround time a lot of times they can get in and out of a port so they can go load up if they're not loaded there in port to take stuff back to where they come from. It's a massive amount of money, I'm pretty sure.
The ship waited. 1 month passed, 2 months, 6 months, then 10 months. And eventually the ship and all of its crew found itself being stranded at sea for nearly an entire year with no end in sight.
How do you feel if you're the family of one of the people that's on the ship? A year, and you're on the ship and you're in the same harbor? At some point in time, when do you turn around and go back? Unless it said an Australian ship. So what point in time do you turn around? It's insane.
And as it turns out, this event would foreshadow one of the biggest economic issues that we are currently witnessing today. But to explain why this event happened, why this event is also so important, and why it's creating a global economic crisis today, you must know that this crisis that we are currently experiencing may have actually started with a small bird just a few decades ago. A bird that—
Wait. All of this from a bird? Please don't. Are we about to launch into the pandemic stuff? Because really could. But for all of that to be caused by a bird, something that happened decades ago, boy, these countries really hold their grudges, don't they?
That caused one of the biggest crises of the 20th century. This is the Chinese sparrow. In the 1950s, the Chinese government didn't know much about these birds except for, well, one thing. And that thing was, they found out that these sparrows ate on average 4 pounds of Chinese grain per year. Now, on its surface, this may not seem like much, especially when you consider that all of the sparrows in China consume only a very small fraction of 1% of the grain in China. But at the time, the Chinese thought that this small fraction of a—
Well, whenever 1% of your grain is being eaten by something other than humans, which, showing Mao Zedong, and, how many people starved under his rule? Some of them communist policies from back in the 50s and 60s don't look so hot. Because, I could see how maybe there's a problem here.
A percentage was too much. You see, China in the 1950s was trying its best to adopt communist economic policies while becoming completely self-sufficient in regards to agriculture. So, in order to accomplish their goal, they banned privatization of all agricultural products within the country. They also decided that all of the food shall be collected and distributed by the government. They also changed their farming techniques to match that of the Soviet Union. They decreased
The Soviet Union, who also had citizens starving. So, no privatization, and you got to take and give all your stuff to the government. See, there's a reason why we don't trust the government. We do to a certain extent, but for stuff like food, hell no. At least not if you're the one growing it.
crop diversity to help boost production quotas. And lastly, they stopped trading resources with all Western nations in hopes of becoming completely self-sufficient. And all of those policy effects took place virtually overnight, which caused a massive shock to China's agricultural system. And soon, China would begin to experience a decrease in their food production, as well as a very serious national famine. However, there was one thing that would push this crisis over the edge, and that, of course, was the sparrow. You see, remember how—
Yes, because the sparrow by itself is responsible for the government's bad leadership. Okay. I want to hear how he ties this in.
Over the edge. And that, of course, was the sparrow. You see, remember how the Chinese government didn't like that sparrows ate a small amount of their grain? Well, as it turns out, the Chinese government decided to order the extermination of all sparrows from the country in hopes of boosting food production. And so, over the course of just a couple years, millions of sparrows in China were killed, and as a result, the sparrow became nearly extinct. And it would not take too long before China realized it had made one of the largest mistakes in the country's history. This one single policy change ended up making their famine substantially worse. You see,
because it probably also ate the bugs that were harming the crops. So not only are they eating your grain, but they're eating the stuff that's also ruining your crops. So
ended up making their famine substantially worse. You see, what China did not know was that sparrows were the main predators for all of the pests in their crop fields, meaning that as soon as the sparrows went away, the crop-eating pests, mainly locusts, began swarming the entire country. And these locusts were not eating just a small fraction of 1% of the food like the sparrows were. These swarms of locusts literally destroyed entire farms or even villages of crops at a time.
this reminds me of that. It reminds me of that T-Rex on Meet the Robinsons, that movie Meet the Robinsons from Disney. It's kind of the same concept here, because birds eat bugs along with, apparently the grain. The bugs is, yeah, not bright there, homie, not bright.
So it was this event that ended up making the famine in China turn into the Great Chinese Famine, a crisis that caused tens of millions of people to starve to death over a 5-year span. And remember, all it took was a few policy changes and one hasty economic decision to cause a crisis on a massive scale. And well, that brings us to today. Remember that ship, the Topaz, that we last saw being stranded at sea in China? Well, as it turns out, this was also because of a hasty economic decision that came from the Chinese government. You see,
there seems to be a running theme here. The Chinese government seems to make a lot of hasty, not thought out or very smart moves. I mean, whenever you go from straight up just communism to everything falling apart, being on the brink of disaster, and having to introduce controlled capitalism so you can actually survive as a nation. Well, maybe if you'd have done some, homework and stuff like that, maybe some of these problems wouldn't have happened. And I know it's not the capitalism. So don't take it, capitalism, from your smartphone or whatever that was, possible thanks to capitalism. Nothing like that. No. What I'm getting at is they've made a lot of dumb decisions over in China. Like the U.S. a lot of countries' governments make really dumb decisions. But China, you got millions upon millions starving because the birds eating the grain. Kill the birds. Oh shit, there's nothing to take care of the bugs that were eating the crops. Crap.
that came from the Chinese government. You see, in June of 2020, just a few months into the pandemic, the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison called for an investigation into the origin of the pandemic in China. Now, on its surface, this may not have seemed like much of a story at the time, but in reality, this would be the instigator for the global crisis that we are seeing today. This is because China did not take this criticism of the Australian Prime Minister very well.
They had to be thinking, damn, Australia's got Republicans too? Jesus, we get it from the US and now Australia. It's a joke. Not a dick. Don't take it hard, okay?
In fact, because of a handful of seemingly minor sentences from the Australian Prime Minister, China decided to start a trade war with Australia. And again, on its surface, there should have been a clear winner of this trade war, as China's economy is roughly 10 times larger than that of Australia's. But what China did not realize was how reliant it was on Australia. You see, China ended up banning or placing high tariffs on things like barley, beef, and about a dozen other Australian products. And as it turns out, one of these banned items was coal. And so, well, that is why in June of 2020...
So is that one of the reasons why they've been having blackouts over there and cities not being able to, like... I've wondered about that, because, well, other than flooding, taking and causing starvation over there, the Yellow River region or something like that, if I'm not mistaken. Anyways, due to the flooding destroying crops and stuff like that, one of the stories that if you pay any attention to news outside of your own country, especially where it concerns China, because large economy and all that, I found it interesting that cities were having blackouts. I was like, it's kind of odd. They should have more than enough coal and ways of, powering their homes and businesses and stuff. This would make sense.
As the Topaz and 60 other bulk carriers were on their way to China,
60?
they all of a sudden were not allowed into Chinese ports with their coal because, well, China overnight banned and canceled all of their trade deals in relation to coal. Now, to most Western nations, coal isn't that important to their respective economies.
Oh, so not only you have power, but steel. I forget about the fact that coal is used in steel production and stuff like that. So that's a twofer. And no wonder the reason why there's been especially in industrial items, because there's been stuff that the company my wife works for has tried to take and get, and it's just not in stock, and they don't know when it'll be in stock and hadn't been in stock in a while. Stuff like this, because we get a lot of steel over here from China, and get a lot of the materials to make stuff from the steel in China. So that makes, wow. I didn't even take and realize that aspect of it, because I'm sure with the steel and stuff like that, it just drives prices up. Or makes it a lot more scarce. Ooh. Sometimes I need to shut up and just watch, but, whatever.
Economies and infrastructure. For example, countries like Canada, France, the UK, and the Nordic countries produce less than 10% of their electricity from coal. And even on the upper end of the Western nations like the United States and Germany, they only produce about 15 to 20% of their electricity from coal. But then we have China. And well, China produces over 65% of its electricity from coal, meaning that the less coal China has available to them, the less likely it'll be able to produce electricity for its country. Now, China is actually the world's largest producer of coal, and roughly 75 to 90% of all coal used in China is produced domestically. However, for coal that is used for industrial processes, like the making of metals, and for a large fraction of its coal power plants, China is reliant upon coal imports from other countries in order to fulfill its needs. And well, who do you think was at the top of that list for coal imports to China in 2020? It was, of course, Australia. Before the coal ban, China was importing roughly 78 million metric tons of coal from Australia per year, and to put that in perspective, the next closest nation was Indonesia, where they were importing roughly 48 million tons of coal.
That type of, especially when it's used for a couple of different applications, but especially with the industrial side. If the bulk of your industrial coal usage comes from imported coal, and you ban said coal from being imported, I'm going to tell you what, that's a huge monkey wrench that you've thrown into your own works just out of short-sightedness. Like, that's massive. And them being one of the, one of the largest world economies. Thanks, guys. You screwed the pooch for everybody else as well. Great God.
And so, slowly, from June of 2020 up until today, China's coal reserves kept depleting, in part due to stopping the imports from Australia. Now, it's also worth noting that during this time, there was some major flooding in southern and eastern Asia that caused many Chinese and Indonesian coal mines to close down. There were also a handful of other policies, such as increasing the safety guidelines for coal companies in China, that also decreased coal production. And so, because of one hasty policy decision against Australia and a few other environmental and policy events, we started to see just a few months ago that Chinese cities began going dark. Power outages began affecting factories and homes, supply chains began getting severely disrupted again, and Chinese banks that had loans with these coal companies began seeing the signs of defaults on these loans.
Which, that's one of the another things, because the banks, and this was about 4, 5, 6 months ago, I was seeing reports on this, the banks over there not letting people pull money out of their accounts, which, never a good sign. Coal being one of the reasons why the bonds and stuff, and the banks are having bonds defaulting and banks having issues. Bro, you want to talk about shoot yourself in the foot. Like, if you've got an economically stable country, regardless of whether or not you're taking and putting out there into the world that you are, and by all intents and purposes, and especially perspective of how the world sees your economy, you take and do something to shoot yourself in the foot this bad. Public outcry? Anywhere else in the world, the public outcry is going to be massive, and bad juju can happen. There, we've got to take and pull out the army again and just pray to God there's no repeat of Tiananmen Square.
And as this began happening, China began implementing new policies such as ramping up coal production in their working mines and also importing more coal from other nations that weren't Australia. They also began mandating cutting electricity consumption from factories and residences, and also made their banks start making extremely risky loans to new upstart coal companies in China. But at the end of the day, none of those short-term solutions worked, and China was forced to do something that it did not want to do. Remember those 60 or so Australian bulk carriers that were stranded in China? Well, as it turns out, China became so desperate for coal that just a few weeks ago, they allowed some of those stranded ships to unload their coal into Chinese ports. Now, it's also worth mentioning that some Australian ships are still stranded after being at sea for well over a year. And many of these ships also got rerouted to different countries like India and South Korea, who ended up actually buying a lot of this stranded Australian coal. But the effects of this Chinese energy crisis, and what it should be called, which is the Chinese coal shortage, are being felt worldwide right now. Many large companies that are reliant on Chinese manufacturing are seeing similar or even longer delays than what they were seeing at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. In fact, there have been a handful of large corporations that have begun switching their manufacturing out of China and into other countries or even domestically, largely because companies are realizing that manufacturing in China is becoming more unreliable. And because of decisions like this and the shutdown of some—
Wait, it takes something like this for you to realize that manufacturing in China is unreliable, not the lead paint found on children's toys or other home goods that we were buying in this country? Really? It takes this for you to figure that out? Alright there. Nice way of paying attention.
Factories and the electricity shortages, China's manufacturing industry shrank for the second time in modern history this year. And so, where is this all going? Well, this coal crisis is already taking a chunk out of China's economy and will likely do so for the foreseeable future. And despite this ongoing energy crisis, China still refuses to lift the ban on Australian coal simply because of a few sentences said over a year ago. And a few recent quotes from a Chinese energy specialist and a Chinese coal data company stated that the biggest provinces now only have 9 to 14 days worth of coal reserves left. And with
That's
winter coming
crazy.
soon in China, the country will have to make a tough decision. Will it potentially allow power outages in winter and a continual shutdown of its core economy simply because of those few sentences said by the Australian Prime Minister? Or will it lift the bans on Australian coal, admitting that the government made a hasty decision that ended up creating an energy crisis that the country didn't expect? What do you think will happen? And all this means is that China has a few weaknesses. And those weaknesses are its energy consumption and its irrational and hasty economic policies. And as it turns out, Australia, the seemingly innocuous Western nation, ended up accidentally revealing the weaknesses of China to the world. It also revealed that Australia is one of the very few nations that can influence China's economy directly to the point of a national crisis. And
That's a global issue. That's more than just a national crisis. Which, yes, that's definitely China's screwed, and they've screwed the pooch on it, and they're paying the price for the hastiness of their government. But thanks a lot, Australia, for the global monkey wrench you've thrown into the works. I joke, I kid.
And who knows, maybe as Australia and other Western nations continue to get closer, we may begin to see a further divide between China and the Western world. Now I just want to make one more quick note, and that is a video game that I am developing now officially has a Steam page. So if you do want to support this channel, just go and check that out and maybe leave a wish list on Steam. That really helps out a lot. But for now, remember.
Well then. I mean, to be honest with you, I wasn't expecting it to be. I didn't realize. I didn't understand. I didn't. Australia is a country that's well respected in the world, and they've got a lot of stuff. Like they're allied with U.S., of course, UK, Great Britain, like of course all that. But they're also on a lot of things. They do try to. They're leaders on some things, right? But they're not that big of a country. Like they're not that big of a country whatsoever. So the fact of the matter being that the politician go, we need to investigate at the outset or after the pandemic has started, and it causes China to knee-jerk react in the way that it did. I think it shows the pettiness of the Chinese government in and of itself, because look, there's no two ways about it. All the first news reports in the world, like if especially if you don't follow mainstream media, at least here in the U.S., because back in February, March of the year that the pandemic hit, before it had become global, Italy wasn't even in the throes, and the U.S. sure hadn't really, at least they hadn't reported that there was a case yet in Washington. Me and my buddy Blake TV on the BNA show that we take and do weekly on his channel, the coronavirus is something he asked me about, and it's something I took and give my opinion on. And we actually watched video of people in China, as well as some the government approved videos that were put out on YouTube with subtitles. But a lot of it, we watched like 3 or 4 videos, and I'd watched over a dozen videos from people in China on the streets taking and showing what was going on, and then smaller independent news sites or news channels on YouTube and outside of YouTube taking and showing the exact result. So the fact of the matter that they'd get pissed off about something like that shows you just how petty and how proud they are, I guess you would say, or arrogant they are. Like, oh, how dare you taking and question our integrity. And it leads to something like this, because so much of the world depends on, I don't know, maybe not so much the world. I know the U.S. does, but I know the global supply chain, as far as steel is concerned, a lot of the steel throughout the world gets it from China. So the fact that a couple of printed sentences of the World Health Organization, a Chinese minister, or excuse me, an Australian minister to the World Health Organization going, we need to investigate, shows you just how much, just how, number one, maybe there's more than what they're saying to it, number one, and that's not being conspiracy theorists whatsoever. That's just, So they get offended like that over just that little bit. We got issues here. But more importantly, I think the fact of them taking just such a knee-jerk reaction have global implications that are still to this day being felt, and especially if you work on the industrial side of things, you work in construction or industry of some sort, whether it be manufacturing or what have you, construction, manufacturing, anything like that, and you rely on products either made in America or in the country that you're in, and the steel, some of the steel that or the steel that's used for the manufacturing is gotten from China or from stuff that's produced steel itself. You try to order the steel itself from China or something like that, and the fact that there's still shortages on so many different things, it's absolutely insane, absolutely insane. And just the fact, just that little bit, just that little itty bit, is what caused all this is insane. Thank you, Australians. Keep y'all's mouth shut down there. I joke, I kid. It's just, can't take criticism, some folks, I swear. I hope y'all enjoyed this. I know I did. It's very enlightening because I didn't realize that's exactly, part of the cause of some of this global shortage. Or it seems like a pretty big cause of this global shortage, but something so minuscule. Did not realize it. And the interesting historical background and the geopolitics within China and Australia itself, and how just something so simple took is what got a lot of this stuff out of whack. Again, very interesting, very well done. Hope y'all enjoyed this. Y'all be good to each other. Love yourselves. Peace.